All right, well, welcome everybody. Welcome to Kohala. And I hope that everybody and their friends and family are all healthy and staying safe in these kind of crazy times. One of the benefits of this, though, is that we have some extra time on our hands, perhaps, and we can do something like this, and I can kind of share my work with probably more people in person than I would otherwise. So today we are going to be talking about the distribution, abundance, and acoustic characteristics of the forest birds in Kohala. I just wanted to start off thanking Pat, my advisor, and the committee, Evan, John, and Esther, who unfortunately is unable to make it with us right now. She's in Spain, and it's 3 in the morning there, so we're not going to make her wake up for this. She'll get a link to it later on. But let's go ahead and get started. So I'd like to continue the thanks with all the folks and organizations that have helped me along the way. As you can see, there is a lot of coordination going on here with this project. Particularly, I would like to thank Elizabeth of the lab. She was the only person that was a dedicated resource for me. She spent probably over a month with me. Hours and hours and days, cutting transects, acting as a secondary for the point counts, and putting up with me. And also Anne for helping me out with the recording. Had a big help from Nick Agarostos and the NARS crew. They dedicated helicopter time and crew time to get to some of the transects that were really far back in the middle of nowhere. I'd like to thank the Kohala Watershed Partnership, specifically Melora and Ton, for linking me up with Parker Ranch and Kahua Ranch and helping me out in the field and also driving me around a little bit. And I would very much like to thank Rick Kemp and Christina Paxton for all the help with the statistics and the analysis with both of the chapters here. As you can see, there are a lot of organizations that I had to coordinate with and get help from. So very, very much thank you to everybody. So as with most Hawaii talks or bird talks in Hawaii in general, we have to kind of start at the beginning and give a little bit of background. I think it's really important now that there might be some folks on here that aren't too familiar with this. So, you know, one of the big questions is how did things get to Hawaii? Here you can see it's a dot in the middle of a vast blue ocean. We're looking at least 2,000 miles to any nearby landmass. So it's very difficult for things to get to Hawaii without the aid of humans. So prior to human contact, essentially there's about 3 ways that things could have gotten to Hawaii. And we call them the 3 W's, which are wind, waves, and wings. Those of you astute enough will realize that birds are one of the 3 vectors. So they are going to be making it there on their own or with the help of a storm. When I was working in French frigate shoals for 6 months, the storms would often bring in some really weird vagrants. We got a great blue heron out there, warbling white-eye, Asia swift. So they do make it out there, but really the thing to think about is 1 or 2 birds does not make a population. That's an extreme bottleneck if you did happen to get a male and female together. Genetically, it's not a high likelihood that they're going to populate an area. So you really have to think of a once in tens of thousands of years event where you get enough plant seeds or birds or whatever might make it out there to populate the islands and actually establish themselves. So one of the groups of birds that did make it out there is the Hawaiian honeycreepers. And so these are a very, very cool family of birds. They are endemic to Hawaii. And there's a very high rate of endemism in Hawaii because it's so difficult to make it out there and establish. And then once you're there, it's pretty hard to leave and kind of get yourself out to other places in the world. You know, you do find some other families of passerine birds in Hawaii with a couple of species, perhaps, thrushes, crow, monarch flycatcher. Really where you see a lot of the Hawaiian forest birds is in this honeycreeper family. And it really originated from one ancestor, the Eurasian rosefinch. And here you can see that over time, adaptive radiation has occurred, and we have seen a lot of species evolve from that original colonizer. They're filling all sorts of niches, different bills that specialize on different food sources. You've got insectivores, generalists, nectarivores, frugivores. And what we see here is really about half of what evolved from that one species, which is really, really cool, really high rate of endemism in the islands there. And there's a high rate of endemism with each specific island as well. If we look at the chart here, there's I'iwi and Apapane that are found on all 4 islands. But that's really about it as far as what is ubiquitous across the Hawaiian Islands. If we look at the amakihi down here, there's one amakihi for each island. So not only is there a high rate of endemism for Hawaii itself, but there's a high rate of endemism for each island in Hawaii as well. So it's a real unique kind of cool situation that's arisen, and these birds are really, really, really unique to the world. I feel like if Darwin had come to Hawaii instead of the Galapagos, he probably would have figured out his theories in a couple months. But there's a catch, and Hawaii has unfortunately earned the moniker of the extinction capital of the world. So there, with a high rate of endemism and a lot of pressure, especially after human contact, we have a high rate of threatened and endangered and species of concern out here. You can see here that Hawaiian is on par, and in fact greater than, other biomes across the entire planet. Not only that, but the percentage of those that are federally threatened or endangered is very high. In terms of the Hawaiian honeycreepers, about 2/3 of the species that had evolved are already extinct. And the ones that are left are in some pretty dire straits. And we'll go through some of that in a sec. So one of the first major things that happened is habitat loss. So here we're looking at Hawaii Island pre-European contact. So the native indigenous culture only had about an 8% human footprint. And they largely stayed out of the forest where these forest birds were. It was a realm that was considered sacred, and most humans had no business going in there. So there were very special circumstances that very specific people and jobs would go into the forest at all. So there wasn't a whole lot of influence on these birds originally. 100 years later, after Europeans contacted Hawaii, we already started to see a pretty big increase in the human footprint. We're looking at the encroachment into the forests, Kona side, starting to see that a little bit on the east side. This whole swath of pink here is the conversion into pasture land, and all of Mauna Kea there, surrounding the top, which is alpine and arid, is pasture land. And then currently it gets pretty bad. So we're at about 41% human footprint, where we are influencing these habitats ourselves, and that's not it, unfortunately. It's not just where we are living and where we are producing agriculture and livestock, but we're bringing other things too, and that's making a huge impact on these birds. So pigs, sheep, goats, all the ungulates that we brought, they have gotten into the forest and they are wreaking havoc. So this is a picture of a pig wallow. So they are destroying the native habitat. They're eating up seedlings and tree ferns and understory plants, and really changing the structure of the understory and the composition of the plants that are there. Here's a nice picture of a fence in Kohala Forest that is dividing one area on the left that is managed, and there are no pigs in there, there are no cows in there, and the forest has had time to regrow to its natural state, And then on the right, we have an area that is under pressure from the ungulates. You can see there's a drastic difference in the canopy cover. The light that's coming through is a big clue on that. There's a drastic difference in the diversity of the understory species. And there's a huge difference in the ground cover. And on the right, you see an introduced grass, which has basically become a monocrop ground cover there. One specifically that sucks up a lot of moisture, so it's really taking away a lot of resources from the native plants and making it hard for them to grow and maintain the diversity that was there. But it's not just grass that was introduced. There are a lot, unfortunately, of invasive plants that grow into mono stands of that plant. Here's Kahili ginger. It's basically all you can see. And so all of those understory plants that the birds are feeding on and using for habitat, nesting, and things like that, they're just not in the area anymore. So those areas that we did see on the map that were still green forest, they're not prime real estate anymore for these birds in all of those places. We also brought some predators along with us, namely the big three, mongoose, rats, and cats. Don't need to go into this too much, but they are little murder machines, and they are putting a huge toll on the birds and their ability to reproduce. And that is not all that we've introduced. Unfortunately, we've introduced diseases as well. Avian pox is one that does create lesions on the legs of the birds. They can lose digits, they can lose entire hands. And that can really take a toll on their well-being and their ability to survive. But the big one, and that's what this picture of is avian malaria. This picture always creeps me out. I would never want to get bit in the eyeball by a mosquito, but it has a very, very, very high mortality rate. And another thing about the malaria is that it is limited by cold. So temperature is a factor here. So here we see a relief of a mountain. You can see there's a lot of potential forest habitat, but there is also a lot of area where the mosquitoes are at. One species in particular, the Eevee, was found to have a 90% mortality rate when bitten by one infected mosquito. So it does not take much to really wreak havoc on the ecosystem here. All of the lowland birds had a real tough toll from the avian malaria. And that's a big reason for the extinction of a lot of birds here in Hawaii. So where's Kohala? We're looking at the footprint here. Some of you may have noticed that there was one little piece of forest up there that got kind of isolated out. That is Kohala. It is the oldest volcano on the island and is extinct. It is a very, very wet forest up there, and it's very hard to get to. There's only one public access point. That's the end of a very, very muddy road. And most of the usage up there by humans is for hunting. So why is it important? So first of all, the isolation is very important. There's a lot of interesting things that do happen when populations are isolated. But one main thing is that they have nowhere else to go. These are very small birds, and their home ranges are measured in hectares, which is not very large, much less than an acre. So they're not moving around a whole lot, and surrounding them with agricultural land and this habitat that's not really suitable for them has really kind of kept them in the spot. And if we go back to this picture here, Kohala has a max elevation of just shy of 5,500 feet, and that's really a small section of it that does get that high. So as we look at this, you can imagine that there's not a whole lot of that forest bird refuge on Kohala where they're not being impacted by these mosquitoes. And one thing that is also very important is that when the weather warms up and climate changes and gets warmer in general, this lower band here is going to rise, and this forest bird refuge is going to shrink. So Kohala is really unique in that it does not have a whole lot of refuge as it is, and it's only going to get smaller. So it's really important for us to keep an eye on that, especially since we have recently added the EEV to the endangered species list. So we now have an endangered species that lives up in this mountain. So Kohala, a lot of people think of it as a wet forest covered in mats of moss, and yeah, there's definitely a lot of that out there. And a lot of people think of it as kind of like an island refuge of native forest that's surrounded by agricultural pasture land. And yeah, it's that too, but there's a couple other really, really interesting biomes that are out there. On the windward side, it's very windy. The trees do not grow very large, and you end up with these real thickets of aluhe, which is a fern. Some of you are very familiar with this, and those of you that are, this was after clearing the transect, taken at eye level, and that's a person 6 feet away. So that's about as thick of an aluhe patch as I've ever been in. I remember it took me 3 hours to cut through 150 meters of transect in the worst of it. So it's pretty gnarly out there. There's also some really cool high elevation bogs. This is the kind of land where it looks fairly stable, and then you step down and you end up up to your knee in mud. So really, really rainy, really interesting habitat out there. So that's kind of the background for it. Now let's kind of dive into what I was doing. I had 2 questions that I was looking at. So really, another reason that Kohala is interesting is there's not a lot of bird research that's been done out there. There has only ever been one other survey to see what's out there, what the densities and distribution is. And that was the landmark Hawaiian Forest Bird Survey, which in that location happened in 1979, but wasn't published until 1986. So the first question is kind of just let's see what's going on now, and if we can compare that to the original survey and see what's changed. The other thing I wanted to look at is how this isolation from other forest bird communities has affected the song structure of these native birds, and we'll get into why that's important a little later. So first, let's start off with the density and distribution. So we do that with what's called point counts. And this is me doing a point count survey. And it's part of distance sampling. So the way that this works is we have transects, and we place stations at selected intervals along those transects. And at each station, you do an 8-minute count, where during those 8 minutes, you record all the birds that you see or hear, and then estimate the distance to the bird from where you are currently at. And then from that information, you can use some fancy program called distance that creates a probability of detection for the species. And from that, it will give us an estimate range of abundance and density. So here is a satellite image of Kohala Mountain, and the red dots there are going to be the original Hawaiian forest bird transects. You can imagine since 1979, it's grown back significantly. And rather than, reestablish those transects and cut through what is essentially pristine native forest, we chose to use existing transects that were weed transects. I say chose lightly because we were essentially told to, because it is a natural area reserve, and you can't just go out there cutting whatever you want. These transects are established independently of the birds. It's a weed transect design, so it is still following the rules of the point counts. And so we chose the ones that were in the 4,000-foot contour. So the elevation range at which the avian malaria vector dies, essentially, is somewhere between 4,000 and 4,500 feet. And that's going to vary depending on weather patterns and local climates and things like that. So while doing these, we also measured a bunch of other variables that were in the area. including weather variables, vegetation, things like that, to try and see if any of that was correlated with the bird abundance and densities that we found. Unfortunately, you do need to have a lot of detections for each category class of each covariate to get a good reading on that. And we're looking at about 50 detections of each species within each class of each covariate to really get that down. So going forward, this is really good information to have. And if people continue these surveys, we might find some more of this to be important, but none of this was found to be significant outside of the main detection function. So we did find enough detections for 7 species to get density and abundance information, 4 endemic species and 3 introduced species. We did find 7 other species while we were out there. 4 of them were not found originally in the 1979 survey, but the numbers that we found were not very high. The Hawaiian hawk is a bird that, while it does use the forest, when we detected it, it was flying around pretty high. So it's kind of an opportunistic thing whether or not you might find one of those flying around while you're doing your 8-minute point count. The other 3 birds are introduced species that are fairly commonly found in the pastures that surround Kohala on the eastern or western side. And it's all of these detections were taken within the first 150 meters or so of the pasture. So that's not super surprising that they may not have found those as well when they were looking in 1979. The 7 species that we did have enough detections for, one that a lot of people would be interested in is the EV. You know, that's one that a lot of people were really wondering if there was an established population in Kohala or whether it was, you know, transient population. You can see that there is a drastic increase in the number of birds and the number of stations, but that is possibly an artifact of the stations being a little bit, or the transects being a little bit closer together and having more transects in potential EEV habitat. Another one to look at is the Elepaio. So this is the only bird that we did not see a drastic increase in density and abundance. Outside of Elepaio, we're looking at somewhere between 270 and 720% increase in density and abundance. And you know, we need to take this very cautiously. Since 1979, there's been a lot of improvements upon the protocol for doing these surveys. And one major thing that's changed is that we've learned that it's a lot easier to detect the birds during breeding season. And the original 1979 survey was done at the end of July, last 2 days in July. And the Elepaio does breed during July. Our surveys took place between March and May, which is overlapping breeding season for all of the forest birds out there. So seeing the Elepaio having a fairly similar density and being in breeding season during both surveys might indicate that they're, you know, not really changing a whole lot. And it's kind of hard to tell whether, you know, the large increases in density and abundance that we've seen in 2017 is an artifact of the change in sampling protocol, or if it is truly an increase in the density and abundance of these birds. There's another bird I want to point out, and that's the Japanese bush warbler, which was not found at all in 1979 anywhere on Hawaii Island. So this is definitely an introduction to both the island and to the area. And there are enough birds to have detection functions and really look at proper density and abundance. So let's start looking at some of these species and get to know them a little bit better. First one we'll look at is the Hawai'i amakihi. So this is a endemic honey creeper. It's a generalist bird, so it feeds on a variety of things. It also occurs in a lot of different habitats, so it's not very particular about a specific one, or at least it will inhabit other ones. The highest densities are found in drier woodlands and forests above 1,500 meters, and one reason this bird is really of interest is it is demonstrating a tolerance to avian malaria. So I mentioned earlier that that had taken a huge toll on the birds. You know, think of it as a disease that gives a very, very, very high fever that will kill the birds. So what we have seen in the last 10 or so years is, you know, birds such as the amakihi, they're not getting as high of a fever, and so they're able to survive the infection of the malaria and continue to live after they have contracted the disease. So here we can see the information from the original 1979 survey. The red oval there is going to be the scope of the current survey that we looked at. So for the amakihi, we're really in this area looking at a big old blob of birds, fairly uniform density there. And what we see here is where they're at now. And you'll notice a huge difference in how this is presented. Originally, back in when they were doing this, they did not have the computer programs that we do nowadays. So we were really looking at hand-drawn maps back then. Now we have you know, geospatial information and programs that we can use. So here I used ArcMap. I can plug in all of the station abundance information, and it will extrapolate that across a range, predefined range. So we could get a lot more fine-grained resolution to the information that we have now than we did back then. So here we can see that we do still have a fairly big blob of birds, but rather than being a little bit more uniform, we are seeing a nice hot spot up here. Keep an eye on that. That will come into play with other species as well. And let's keep going. So Apapane is another endemic humming creeper. This guy is, excuse me, mostly a nectarvorous. It does opportunistically feed on foliage insects. You got to get your protein somewhere. It is the most abundant Hawaiian honey creeper. I would venture to guess amakihi would give it a run for its money if it was not separated species by island. So that is something to think about as well. The Apapane will occupy just about every available habitat, but it is a little bit more taking a liking to the wet ohia or ohia koa forest, which we do see in Kohala pretty ubiquitously up at the top. So one thing to look at here is, rather than having a uniform distribution of birds in 1979, we do see a couple of hot spots here and here. With less of density in that one area where we saw a hotspot with the amakihi. Now, is that the case currently? No. These guys are really kind of congregating in that hotspot as well. So now we might be asking, what's in that hotspot? So that is going to be fairly close to the summit. We do have very pristine native forest up there. There's not as much introduced invasive species as there are in some of the other areas of the forest. And we've got one of those nice high elevation bogs as well. So we have a real nice habitat for these forest birds. It is also above that line of the avian malaria influence as well. So here we can see that little blue circle that I drew there. That is that hot spot that we're seeing now that was not there back in 1979. So the next bird we're going to look at is the elapaio. So this is a monarchine flycatcher, also endemic. So this is not in the honey creeper family, but it is a separate family. This is an insectivorous bird. It has a separate subspecies for each island, but on the Big Island, it has 3 subspecies. It has never occurred on the Maui complex. So we're looking at a Kauai, an Oahu, and then 3 Big Island birds. The Kohala population is a subspecies that is also seen in Hawaii Volcanoes National Park, which interestingly enough is not the closest population to Kohala. The Mauna Kea population would be that, and that is a different subspecies. It also does like wet mesic forest above 1,500 meters. So you'll see kind of a trend there that these native birds do really like that forest above 1,500 meters. And one big part of that is because if they go down too much further from that, they're not going to live. So here we could see that there was kind of a thicker density up in that hot spot that we see now for the forest birds, but that they did kind of extend downslope from there and off to the southeast. And really it's kind of about the same. You know, there is a bit of a hot spot that we see in that area. And that could be an artifact of having more stations in that area to kind of delineate that. It could be part of the analysis that we have in getting a finer grain resolution there. But essentially, we're looking at a fairly similar distribution of the birds with yellow pio. So let's move on to the EEV. This is another honey creeper, another nectarvorous one. It's a really cool bird in that its bill shape is co-evolved with some of the understory plants that used to be very, very widespread throughout Hawaii. This is the one that is the most susceptible to the avian malaria, and it does also have the highest densities up in those high wet forests. So here we can see originally in 1979, they did find EEV in Kohala. We did have that hotspot of density there, but they did move into the lower elevation and off to the southeast as well. Now that has changed drastically since then. So they have really kind of concentrated in that hot spot and have become absent in some of the areas that they were found back in 1979. So go back here, those two red blobs that I put on there, those are gone. We didn't do any transects off in this area, but I could venture to guess that those are not around anymore either. We're really getting into less high quality habitat for the EEV, and we're really getting into low enough elevation that avian malaria would be taking a huge toll on them. So here, just going back to the current, I've kind of highlighted that 4,000 foot contour line. I'm sorry, 4,500 foot contour line, where really that's kind of the safe zone right now for these birds, because the avian malaria, due to the temperatures, is really not making it up that high. So it seems like they're really getting pushed into that sweet spot of habitat that's also mosquito-free, and that's not super surprising. So let's go on to the three introduced species. So Japanese bush warbler. This was introduced to Hawaii in 1929. You'll see that as a trend with some of these introduced species, because there was a group of people that thought that Hawaiian forest birds weren't cool enough and they wanted to bring some other ones in. So this little guy was native to Japan and Asia, largely eating insects, but will opportunistically eat fruits and nectar. It prefers really, really thick understory habitat, and this was the one that was not present at all on the island of Hawaii at all in 1979. So there is no 1979 data to show, but currently you can see that there's kind of a low density of these birds basically everywhere in the study site that we found. So they're there, they're not super thick. They could be interacting with the birds and the native birds, but it doesn't seem like it's a huge enough population that it would be really displacing a lot of them. The next bird we're looking at is the red-billed Laethrix. So this was first introduced in 1911, possibly. Data is a little hard on that, but it was definitely introduced or reintroduced in 1928 or 1929, native to southern China and northern India, primarily eating fruit, and is more abundant in mesic forests. So here we can see back in 1979, so this dashed line here is the extent of the original survey. So they're basically everywhere that they did survey, with a hot spot in that sweet spot. And now we see that they're pretty uniformly distributed all throughout the study site that I surveyed as well. So we do have a little bit of a hot spot there, but it's still fairly uniform distribution. Let's move on to the last little guy. This is the warbling Hawaiʻi. Some of you may know him as the Japanese Hawaiʻi, but that was recently changed. This was introduced in 1929, native to Japan and Asia. This is another generalist bird, fairly similar to amakihi in that it will feed on fruit, nectar, and insects, and all sorts of things. It's kind of like the apapane in that it occupies a huge variety of habitat. The greatest densities are going to be in that Mesa Koa Ohia forest, which we do see a lot of in Kohala. And they do tend to prefer habitat with introduced ground cover. So you'll see them in native forests and you'll see them in non-native forests, if just as much, if not more. So once again, looking at the 1979 survey, you can see that it was found everywhere. They are very ubiquitous. There was a real huge hotspot right here, which unfortunately was not within my survey scope. But what's interesting here is that there was a lower density right in the center of my survey scope, and you will see that that has changed. And these guys are everywhere, and they are thick. You know, you do see a hotspot in that sweet spot where everybody else is kind of hanging out. But there's another hot spot down here. And remember when I said that they do prefer understory that's introduced? Those two transects on the bottom right there are probably the most non-native understory that I saw in Kohala. Lots of kahili ginger and non-native plants there, non-native trees as well. So both the canopy and the understory are fairly introduced there. So, you know, let's kind of wrap through this. You know, really have to drive this home that because of the changes in the survey protocol, we need to be very cautious about interpreting direct comparisons. But it does seem like the birds are moving into prime high elevation habitat. You know, the introduced species have had exposure to avian malaria before, so they're kind of exceptions to this. But they are also kind of really enjoying that nice prime habitat up in the high elevation, and you know, could be competition for those native forest birds. The Elapayo did have a change in density and abundance that was inconclusive. All the others were positive. You know, essentially, you know, over this sort of time scale, somewhere between 25 and 50% change would be considered under that inconclusive. So we would really need to see a huge change to say that there was a difference, and we did. We saw between 300 and 700% change. But once again, because of those changes in the timing of the surveys, we really can't make a solid direct comparison with the density and abundance. We did see the establishment of a new introduced species, but the real important thing here is that this is a new baseline for future surveys. So we followed the protocols that all of the surveys going forward would be using. So it would be really easy to do comparisons and monitor these birds going forward and seeing how climate change is going to impact them in the future. All right, so let's take a little break and enjoy the forest for a second. And let's move on to the second question. So looking at how the isolation from all the other communities has affected the song structure. So why are we looking at bird song? Essentially, you know, there's two different ways that the birds learn their song. One really isn't learning at all. It's ingrained in their DNA. You can raise these birds in a dark room with no interaction with any other bird, and when they get old, they'll start singing their song just like every other individual in their species. But there's a group called the Ausine passerines, which these Hawaiian forest birds are part of, and they learn their song. They learn them from their parents and their neighbors. And it's going to vary among populations, and it can change very rapidly. You can think of it as kind of a regional dialects that might be, you know, changing as the times go on. This song is involved in species recognition in many birds, including these birds. You know, it's going to be territorial defense and marking, and it's going to be attracting mates. So especially with attracting mates, major differences in the bird song can reinforce reproductive isolation. If the ladybirds don't recognize the male bird's song as their species, they're not going to mate. And so that can really kind of separate a population that may not be super separated spatially. So what are some of the things that impact bird song? So the learning process, you know, some of these little birds are making imperfect copies from their friends and relatives. Some of them are innovating new things, and it's, you know, some of these things pick up, some of them don't. Habitat connectivity is a big thing. You know, think of it as being able to communicate with, you know, your neighbors. You see this in the United States. We do have some, you know, fragmentation across large spatial scales, and we have regional dialects. And you know, we don't speak like Southern folk because we don't have a whole lot of contact with them. Environmental conditions as well can do that. The way the song refracts off of the vegetation, atmospheric things can change how these songs are broadcasted. And selection is going to go towards the songs that broadcast the furthest. Another thing that will impact the bird song is the available acoustic space. So if there's some species of insect or bird that's really, really noisy and taking up a specific frequency range, other birds may change their song in frequency or temporal aspects to maximize the available acoustic space so that they're able to be heard. So in Kohala, we're really kind of focusing on this little guy, the amakihi. And why are we looking at the amakihi? You know, once again, it's repopulating these lower elevation habitats and demonstrating an evolved tolerance to avian malaria. So these areas that are very isolated may not be isolated in the future. So it's something to really kind of look at and see how that plays out. Also, the song types are easily classified, and the song is easy to find in a spectrogram. We'll go into the amount of manpower it takes to look through all the recordings we did, but this really does kind of cut down on the amount of effort just to get through this. So this is an example of the amakihi song. The red box is the song, while the blue box is the syllable. And so the syllable has a distinct shape to it. The amakihi song is a repeated trill of the same syllable. So we can classify each song based on the shape of the syllable. This is done in a program called Raven, which is manufactured by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. So we can box off the song, and so we would manually box off the song, and Raven would automatically record frequency and some temporal aspects of the song, and then we would manually classify the syllable structure. So what we're looking at here is we're looking at the 4 closest populations of amakihi, which would be Pu'uva'awa'a, Pu'ula'au, the Kapukas, and Hakalau Wildlife Refuge, to Kohala. And the way we do that is we put a recording device in the tree, and then we hide it, and we go away. And these recorders, we put them out in pairs, at least 250 meters apart during breeding season months. So it was from March through May. And we had a total of 8 song meters throughout the 5 sites. So I personally did the recordings at Kohala and Pu'ula'au, and then used existing recordings from the other 3 sites. We had one individual classify all of the song types so that we maintain consistency there. So like I said, we recorded between March and May at those 2 sites, and that was from 2016 through 2017. The other 3 sites were between 2013 and 2015. We used 4 days of recording for each song meter, with 8 song meters per location. So we're looking at 12 hours of recording per song meter and about 96 hours of recording per location. So luckily 3 of those sites were already analyzed, but still that's over 190 hours of recording that I had to go through and identify these amakihi songs. So having something that was easy to identify and easy to classify really made a world of difference. And if you look at some of the other birds that are out there, like the apapane, they can have very, very complex dialects with numerous syllables per song and a whole lot of variation there. So it was really nice to have something that was a little bit easier to really kind of hone in on. So we did end up with over 7,000 amakihi songs and found 57 unique song types among the 5 locations. We also recorded song length, the number of syllables per song, and then 3 frequency characteristics as well. And before we get into the stats, let's take a breather and just enjoy the forest for a second, because it's going to get pretty complicated. So there are 4 different things that we did with that information. The first is we looked at both within and among population differences in the song types. So this is looking at the syllable classifications. We used non-metric multi-dimensional scaling, which can be bolstered by 2 different statistical analyses. It's basically using a presence-absence of each song type in each location, and then using some stats magic to kind of get some information about how similar they are. We did do a test for correlation between distance and that similarity index. And so real quick, I'll just point out that yes, there was a correlation between distance and that similarity index. So the farther away song meters or populations were, the less similar they were in those song types that they had. We did look at each variable to see if they were significantly different among populations. And then we looked at principal component analysis of all of those variables together to see how unique some of these populations were. So here we're looking at the within location variability. So this is the variability of song types within each specific location. So we're not comparing locations to locations yet. Really the one thing to glean out of this, and the only thing we can say, is these 2 are different from each other. The rest of them, we can't say that they're actually different from any other one. It's only specifically the Hualalai, Pu'u Va'ava'a, and the Pu'ula'au populations that have different variability within that location. And you can see that with this, it's the per disp. For all of you non-science folks, a p-value is essentially a reflection of the percentage of confidence that we are that this information is correct. So a 0.05 p-value is kind of the standard at which we accept something to be accurately portrayed by the statistics, and that's essentially saying that we're 95% confident that that is true. The among location differences is the per MANOVA, and here we can see with the p-value that they're all different from each other. So they're all very unique that way. So when we see this, it's hard to say that one thing is more similar to another just by that, but luckily we can do that with the NMDS. So this is a graphical representation of that. So the way this works on the X and Y axis is each point, the closer it is to another point, the more similar it is to that point in terms of the song types that are there. So here I've outlined the Kohala population there. And you can see there's no real solid overlap with any other population, but the closest that anything gets is going to be that Pu'uva'ava'a Hualalai population. You can see a huge variation in that Pu'ula'au population. You know, really, really big differences between the points there. So each kind of, and that was kind of reflected in that each location, there was not a whole lot of shared song types at all. Each song meter was very unique in the song types that were there in that location. So, you know, we can look at this and we can say, yes, you know, there is one location that is a little bit more similar than the others, but the stats is also telling us that they are all different. So it's hard to really kind of take away any definitive piece of information from this other than they are all different, and some things are slightly closer than others to how similar they are in the song structure there. So one more quick break because we're going to get into a whole nother level of stats here. Looking at the individual variables, we found a couple of interesting things. The amakihi and Kohala sing 78% more notes per song, but there's no difference in song length. So all that's saying is that they sing faster. And we're 99.9% sure that that is true. There was one kind of crazy outlier there. There was one bird that sang 2 songs. One had 43 syllables in the song. The other song had 53. Just to give you context, all the other amakihi songs were generally between 7 and 11 syllables. And this bird sang for about 13 seconds for one song, whereas most of the other amakihi songs were about 3 seconds in length. So someone out there is singing a long, long song. We took him out of the equation because that was really kind of, well, it wasn't really doing anything, but it was just weird. We also found, coincidentally, that the Pu'ulau amakihi sing 28% lower frequency. And that is kind of following that adaptive acoustic hypothesis that I brushed on a little bit earlier. Essentially, in open habitats, when there's not a lot of vegetation to reflect off of, lower frequency sounds will travel further. And that location is a fairly open canopy forest that's really kind of shrubby with one specific species of tree, the mamane, that's kind of growing out from more or less of an understory. So it's not super surprising that there are lower frequency sounds in that habitat, but it's kind of cool that we've kind of confirmed that acoustic adaptive hypothesis in that area, at least with that one aspect of the song. So then we looked at principal component analysis. So essentially, this is taking all the variables that we measured, and it's going to create axes that are made up of all of those variables. So really what we're looking at here is one axis that is very heavily influenced by these 3 variables. We're looking at another one that's heavily influenced by these 2, and then a third one that is mainly influenced by this one here. This proportion of variance is going to be the percentage of explanatory power that axis has towards the entirety of the songs that we measured. So basically this is saying that 36% of the first axis, or the first axis explains 36% of the variation in amakihi song that we observed. And then we can add that together cumulatively to see that these 3 axes do explain about 77% of the variation that we observed with the amakihi. Graphically, we can do that. You can kind of see that the 3 populations here that overlap, Hakalau, Hualalai, and the Kapukas, they're very overlapping, but there's 2 that are kind of not. It's really hard to determine specifically if that is accurate with just the graph, but we can load those axes into linear mixed models as well. And we did that and determined that yes, indeed, both of those are statistically different populations from those axes as well. So really the takeaway from that is that the Kohala amakihi are very unique. It's going to be both in the song diversity, and that's the unique syllables that they use, and the acoustic properties of their song as well. One thing to think about is what's going on with that real fast song that they have out there. That really does not follow the predictions of any sort of environmental acoustic hypotheses. This may be an artifact of sexual selection. Think of something like a peacock. They have that huge train of feathers. It's not, adaptively beneficial to the bird. The ladies like it, and they select mates that have really, really, ornate trains, and that's what's going on there. So that might be what's happening with these birds in Kohala, is that sexual selection is selecting for birds that sing faster. It's definitely something to look into with future studies. We coincidentally kind of learned that the Pu'ulau amakihi are unique as well, both in song diversity and acoustics, just like the Kohala amakihi. Wasn't something that we were really setting out to prove, but it's something that we did find along the way. We did confirm that isolation by distance. That was that Mantel test. So the variation is really influenced by the distance. And the real question is has the divergence that we've seen reinforced the reproductive isolation? And that'd be something that future studies can look at. Behavioral analysis can see if the birds will respond to the songs of the neighboring populations and vice versa. And if the males don't respond territorially and the females don't respond in a sexual selection manner, then that really is reinforcing that reproductive isolation. And we may be witnessing a subspecies or a speciation of the amakihi in the Kohala area, even with the repopulation that's happening in the lower elevations. All right, so just to kind of wrap up everything, it looks like the native Kohala forest birds are getting pushed into higher elevation habitat and a little bit more pristine native habitat. We're looking at a apparently stable population of these birds above 4,000 feet, if not increasing in density and abundance for all of them except for the alapaio. And then we're looking at very unique song types and acoustic properties of the Kohala amakihi. So we really did kind of find out a lot there with those studies. So once again, I do want to say thank you again to everybody that helped out with this. I cannot stress enough how this could not have happened without the efforts of all of these people. And I wanted to open this up to questions. Well, I don't see any in the chat, but if anybody has any questions, you can scroll down to the bottom left of the screen and unmute yourself. And if you just start talking, we can get some questions if you have any.
Keith, I have a question.
Yeah.
So you talked about the idea that the original Scott et al. 1986 surveys were done in the summertime when there might be a different distribution of birds or density of birds. Did you ever go up to the Kohalas in the summertime to see if there was less birds vocalizing or moving around?
I did go scout up there during the summertime initially to kind of see where it was at, but that's kind of a coincidence. I wasn't doing that specifically to do any sort of measurements and see that. And really, you know, one of the main reasons why we did not replicate the survey in that summertime month to do a direct comparison is that it was explicitly expressed that we wanted to have a baseline to move forward with. And that was one of the conditions of the permitting.
Any other questions? Well, Keith, I did have one question. It's also related to that. Can you hear me okay, Keith?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, it's also related to that original survey. You mentioned that you saw 4 species of birds. I think there was the pheasant, Kalish pheasant, the Hawaiian hawk even, the EO.
Yeah, Urkel's Franklin and Eurasian skylark.
Yeah, that they didn't see back then, which their transects, I mean, your transects started right on the edge of the fence from what I remember, where it wasn't really grassland where your transects started, right? So
correct, but they were those species also, with the exception of the hawk, their vocalizations are very loud and carry fairly far too.
Yeah.
And it seems like that might be something that would be opportunistic as well, just if they happen to be doing the point count during the time that an Urkel went and did some crazy laugh song.
Well, I mean, you know, for like the Kalish pheasant, I think it was introduced probably in the early 60s, right? So it may not have even gotten up into the Kohalas back then. So you might be, you know, documenting sort of the range expansion of that.
Yeah, it definitely could be. It's really tough to say though, you know, without having, you know, over 50 detections, we really can't, you know, look at the density and abundance or anything like that. So it's really hard to kind of make any sort of comments on anything that didn't have enough detections to do an analysis on.
How many EO did you see in the study?
It was 4, and it was 2 pairs, or I think it could have even been the same pair, just on 2 different stations on the same transect. I actually believe it was one of the ones that you came out with me on.
Okay, no, it's interesting that they've, yeah, they may have rebounded a bit since that time too, but yeah, it's hard to say, like you're saying, based on sample size. Thanks.
Did someone else have a question? I heard someone.
I have a question, Keith. I'm trying to figure out what the take-home message is for the EEV. It seems like there's some good and some bad. What would you say is your take-home for that species?
Well, one of the big take-homes is it looks like there is an established population there. And that was, you know, kind of up in the air a little bit, whether it was transient or an established population. But we did get enough detections to really, and across a wide range of area up there to really kind of say that, yes, there are EEV up there and they are living there. You know, the other thing too is that, like, it does seem that they are being impacted by the avian malaria and potentially climate change moving that malaria zone up a little bit higher. You know, I think, you know, once again, it's really difficult to say, especially with the EV, because there weren't a whole lot of detections in the original survey. And we just barely hit over the 50 needed to do a solid analysis on this survey. So we really need to continue to monitor this population before we can make any sort of definitive statement. But it does seem that they're there, and it does seem like they're getting pushed higher and higher into that area that's mosquito-free.
Okay, thank you.
So just following up on that, you know, you mentioned that Kohala is an island of habitat, and that the previous studies were done in the summertime, so it's difficult to do any density comparisons. But do you feel like the EV would, you feel like the density would be different if you did it in the summertime for EV? And if so, that means that they would have to fly out of that area, right, across large expanses of grassland non-habitat.
Yeah, I would imagine that if we did it in the summertime, the one major difference would be that it would be harder to detect them because they would not be singing as often to attract mates. So I think the big difference would be that we would just have less detections.
Okay. Yep.
And that is exactly why the current protocol is to do it during the breeding season. It's just so that we can get enough detections to make you know, a little bit more accurate representation of the population.
Yeah. Yeah. Does anybody else have questions? Yeah, so the plan is for, you know, Keith's committee to reconvene after this, and so we'll have a number of kind of different types of questions, I think. But yeah, if there's no other questions for now, maybe we can move on to phase 2 of the thesis defense here.
Well, thank you everybody for coming to see this. I really appreciate having you all here, and I hope that you guys enjoyed it and learned a couple things.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Keith.
Thanks, everyone.
Nice job.
Yeah. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
I'm going to stop recording.